Welcome, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. We'll just give folks a few moments to arrive and then we'll kick things off. So again, welcome. I'll introduce myself. I'm so pleased to be here. My name is Emily, and I do digital marketing for Teachers College Press, the publisher of the book Curating a Literacy Life, which our panel will look at a little bit more closely a little later on. On behalf of Teachers College Press, which is based at Teachers College, Columbia University, welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your afternoons to join our webinar. We're going to be talking about literacy, curation, fandom, and much more. We're going to look at how educators can use students' digital literacies, their devices, social media, and so on to improve their literacy learning. And we're going to look at the work of some educators in Cleveland and see what they are already doing to bridge this gap between students in school and out of school literacies. So we have a lot of interesting ground to cover. And now I'd like to introduce you to the scholars and educators who will be taking us through these ideas. First, please welcome Dr. William Kist, Professor Emeritus of Education at Kent State University. The idea of curation as a process for inspiring student-centered learning was developed by Dr. Kist and explored in his recent book, Curating a Literacy Life. Bill has been working with schools on national and international levels for 20 years, particularly focused on high-yield instructional strategies in urban settings. He's joined in conversation today by Dr. Henry Jenkins, the Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, and Cinematic Arts and Education at the University of Southern California. He is the author of or editor of 21 books, including Convergence Culture and By Any Media Necessary. We also have with us this afternoon Shannon Davis, who is an English teacher at Glenville High School in Cleveland. Active in her community as a coach and motivator, Shannon has presented at NCTE and published in national and state journals. She was also a contributing writer to the book, Curating a Literacy Life. I want to note there's another contributor to the book that we're here to discuss today, Ga-Vita Haynes, who is unfortunately able to join us this afternoon, but I wanted to acknowledge her contribution to the book. Finally, some housekeeping before I hand it over to our panel. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. The video will be sent to all the participants within a few business days, so please share it with any colleagues who couldn't join us but may find it valuable. There will be a discount available on Curating a Literacy Life, granted exclusively to attendees of this webinar. You'll find the details on how to access that discount in the same follow-up email in a few days' time. Lastly, we are reserving some time at the end for your questions, so please submit them using the Zoom chat panel, and we'll do our best to get to those at the end of the hour. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our panel. Please welcome Bill Kist.
Thank you, Emily, and we're excited to be here today to tell you about the work that we've been doing. And I'm going to share my screen now and get ready to show. Can you all see the PowerPoint, at least the one people that I can talk to here? Can we see it? I'm taking that as a yes. So I am going ahead and saying that this book started out of some coaching, instructional coaching that I did at Glenville High School, starting back in the fall of 2018. And I'm sure many of you on this Zoom know what an instructional coach is. And I can assure you that when I went to Glenville, I ended up learning a lot more than the teachers ended up learning from me. This book really came out of weekly coaching meetings that we had in Miss Shannon Davis's room, her classroom. We would meet there during second block, and we would debrief about things that we had seen in each other's classrooms. Sometimes we would center our discussion around a book, and we just, one of us would take notes on the trends that we were seeing. And these notes led to presentations that we did on the state level in Columbus, and then we presented at NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English in Baltimore in the fall of 2019, where we met Emily Spangler and talked about turning this into a book. The book really came about during the time that Miss Davis was teaching the book, The Hate You Give, to her 10th graders. And I talk about this in the book. The moment that really stimulated the book, or inspired the book, I should say, was a morning I was in Miss Davis's classroom and she said, "Take out your cell phones." And that was not a phrase that I was used to hearing in many of the schools that I visit. And she said, "We're going to be researching athletes who used their voices similar to the character Star, and how she used her voice in The Hate You Give." I'm used to being in schools where the attitude is put your phones away, eyes up here. And please understand that I do think it's appropriate sometimes for teachers to say, let's put the phones away, let's focus on something else. But I'm not used to seeing the active use of phones as I saw in Miss Davis's classroom. At the same time that I was working with them, I also was observing my own children and how they would collect certain objects and write things down in their notebooks. They would repurpose these objects into different creations. My one daughter especially would like to carry her notebook along when we would go to the museum and take notes. It seemed like my own children kind of went effortlessly back and forth from digital to analog, to digital to analog. Here's an example of my daughter trying to do yoga in response to a video that she saw on YouTube. Doing online jigsaw puzzles, syncing up videos, getting 3 iPads together. Here's one of my favorite pictures. My son would like to often look at some kind of how-to video while he was playing with his brooder trucks and restructuring them into these kind of elaborate dioramas at the same time that he was watching a YouTube clip. So this was all kind of going on in the back of my mind as I was working at Glenville and seeing this one-to-one school, and how the students also were going back and forth from digital to analog. And I remember having conversations with kids that had these really sophisticated playlists on Spotify, or would tell me about their studios, their recording studios that they would have in their basements. And this is where we started to kind of develop this curation model, which we kind of put into 4 categories, a process that both students and teachers can follow: collecting, organizing, repurposing, and reflecting. I mean, museum curators obviously do this all the time. It's their job. The thing that we liked about this model was that it blended aesthetics, which is a century-old concept, with the affordances of new media. So curation is kind of an umbrella term, a template for activities that students were working on that we felt helped them play active roles in the world through keeping track of their learning, but also by being proactive regarding local and national issues. And what was exciting was that we were developing these ideas right at the time when the pandemic hit. So Miss Davis and the Cleveland schools had to adapt and go to online instruction. And it seemed like they were able to take some of these ideas from a brick and mortar setting and adapt them fairly well to a digital environment. So just to quickly go through the steps Again, step one is collecting. And this first step involves recognition and appreciation for elements in the world, a work of art, something in nature, a mathematical equation, or a scientific process. Becoming a collector involves the development of an aesthetic sense as students gain practice in truly seeing objects and ideas. How do we know what's worth collecting? What are the criteria that we use to aid us in making those decisions? And about this time, I also read Henry Jenkins's comics and stuff, and I felt that there was a very similar kind of mindset that he was describing, and I'm so thrilled to have him here today as a respondent. Step two is organizing. How do you, now you've got all this stuff, how do you organize it? I saw my own children organizing. I saw Miss Davis's students organizing their reports and research projects on athletes. This step also demands that students think about methods of organization that are best for them, not just automatically following a template that is enforced by the teacher, but how does the student, how does the child want to organize all this stuff? Repurposing. This involves kind of transforming what's been collected into a new whole, most likely exhibited or performed for an audience in some way. How has the collecting and organizing suggested something new, either in terms of concept or presentation? And then finally, reflecting. This fourth step serves as a pause to think about what has been learned, what growth has occurred as a result of the first three steps. And now I want to turn it over to Ms. Davis to tell us a little bit about this amazing setting where we did this work, Glenville High School in Cleveland.
Thank you, Dr. Kist. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shannon Davis. I'm an English teacher at Glenville High School in Cleveland, Ohio. I've been there for 7 years. However, our school has a very, very strong legacy and connection to the community. Glenville is connected to touchstones of the 20th century and now the 21st century of American history, from being the birthplace of Superman to the site of a speech by Dr. King in 1967 to the location for much work in the areas of social justice and racial equality. Here's a picture of our school here, established in 1892. And I believe this building was built in 67 because that's the year my mother graduated from there. All over the school, you will find quotes from Dr. King just to uplift and motivate our students. One of the activities that we did to start with, again, as Dr. Kist stated, came from the theme of using your voice. When we first started the unit, back when we were teaching The Hate You Give, our main theme was using your voice. Since then, it has kind of evolved and become a social justice unit, not just on using your voice, but at this time, we really wanted to encourage our students to use their voices. We were strongly of the belief that young people don't know the power that they have. They don't understand the power of their voices. We chose The Hate You Give, and we tried to choose books that were relatable, relevant, and remarkable. We were able to have a phenomenal student engagement with using these texts along with other canonical texts for the unit. One of the best things about it, we were able to connect to our power standards, argumentative writing, citing strong and thorough textual evidence, and analyzing complex characters, among others. One of the assignments that we did, I had them research some athletes because I wanted to show them the power of voices, and I wanted to show them people even prior to social media who were able to use their voices and platforms to speak up or stand up for what was right. So they were given, I put them in groups. Then each group had to choose their group roles, recorder, reporter, taskmaster, timekeeper. Once that was done, each group was given an athlete to research, from more currently Colin Kaepernick, but even going back to Tommy Smith and John Carlos from the 1968 Olympics. Each group had to research how these people use their voices and platforms to speak up. They had to research what was their stance on their particular topic and kind of discuss what they thought about it. At the end, each group was able to do an argument on their position on the person's stance. Did they agree with the person speaking up? Did they agree with the person's stance on the stance or position on the particular topic? And after everything was done, the reporter from each group, they were able to share the research with the class. Another thing we were doing at Glenville, we were just assembling our own text sets. In addition to the books, The Hate You Give and a few others, we were able to integrate a lot of film. We used a portion of When They See Us. Skin is an Oscar-winning short film that we found on YouTube. Harriet was really, really good, and we did a field trip and took some kids to see Harriet. Currently, my favorite go-to for film is Parkland Rising, and I'm going to be starting that soon, just so that the students can see their peers in Florida who are able to speak up loudly about the issues in their school after their school shooting.
So the collecting, and I should note for those of you wondering technically, you know, what the platform was, the Cleveland schools wanted the teachers to use Schoology. So that was the online learning management system, LMS, that they used. But I believe during the pandemic, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Davis, you were also allowed to use Google Classroom.
Yes, we were allowed, yes.
So some teachers had their students assemble all of their projects and the collections on Schoology, some on Google Classroom. But you know, really any LMS that you work in would have the capability of allowing kids to kind of have their own space and collect their stuff in an online environment. So some guiding questions for the collecting stage. I'm not going to read all these. Again, this is all in the book. What's been the most memorable text you've read, viewed, or listened to? Has your ability to see and hear and read deeply changed? Have you enlarged your capacity to see and hear? Are you noticing things differently than you have in the past? If so, what? Name one detail you've noticed, etc. These are some guiding questions. And I want to go back to this screen for a second, because I know a lot of teachers are under pressure to teach canonicals or curriculum such as Springboard. And I know that Miss Davis she would go from some of these texts to doing Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe and The Lottery. And it was a really cool mix though of, canonicals and pop culture texts. Now, Mrs. Haynes is not here today, but we're going to go into the organizing stage. So you've got kids collecting stuff. What are some ways that they can start organizing them? Well, one of the things that she did was the silhouette project. Now I'm forgetting. It's called What's in Your Head. And so the assignment was to use pictures or words to describe what you were thinking about at the time that you were collecting and accessing all these different texts. So here's an example that a student made. She did this both in analog and digital form. So the kid could do an actual cut and paste type of silhouette, or it could be assembled digitally using Adobe or a program like that. Am I telling this correctly, Ms. Davis? Because this is the part that she usually talks about.
Yes, you're correct.
Okay. So she had some of these hanging around the room, but then there were also ones that the kids could look digitally at on in their Google Classrooms. One that I've done for years is the multimodal memoir. And in talking with Henry for this, getting ready for this, he does a similar one that is about objects or a favorite object. I don't think that's the right adjective. What is the term, Henry?
Well, we call it memory objects.
Memory object, right, where the kid brings in a memory object and we compared notes on, and I want to try that idea sometime. I have done this for probably about 10 years off and on, where you just have the kids collect digital representations of texts, but that could include food, fashion, toys, objects, some similar to what Henry's talking about. They can put this together in chronological order or thematically. We found over the years, I've done this with first graders, I've done this with adults, and it's a powerful just kind of acknowledgement and a way of organizing all of these texts and objects that have meant something to you in your life. Here's an example of some ones that I put together, that were important in my life, because I keep this in an online space, and I keep adding to my own memoir over the years. These are books that were important to me as a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old. So the guiding questions for the organizing stage: what are some themes that you see in your reading? What are texts that you want to keep and perhaps reread? What themes did you start with and what themes did you end with? Explain how they morphed. And an important thing threading its way, a tool throughout this, is some kind of learning log, whether it's a quote log or an image log. The kid is supposed to keep some kind of record of from day one till the end. Now, going into repurposing, this is where the teacher allows each student to activate, or reactivate, repurpose what they have found into perhaps a different form, a song, poem, writing letters, or, even an old school literary analysis. And here, Mrs. Haynes, this is where she does an assignment where she has kids collect photographs or do photographs that they have taken of the neighborhood or their own lives, similar again to the multimodal memoir, but more of a reenactment or repurposing of something that they've been learning about. Right when I got to Glenville, there was also a group of students that were working on a documentary project where they were taking research they had done and making it into a documentary with the help of a professional documentary filmmaker. He's in the process of editing this now, and it should be out within the next year. But all of the research, the interviews were done, on-camera interviews were done by Glenville students with participants in the Glenville uprising of 1968. Oh, I forgot I had this slide in here, but here's a student conducting an interview. Another one that I've done over the years, we didn't do it at Glenville, is the Monument Project, where you have the kids take what they've learned about a person and design a monument, a 3D analog monument, or it can be a digital monument in honor of this person. Another one that comes to mind that I should put in here is the multi-genre paper. Of course, Tom Romano has done these for years at Miami University in Ohio, having kids do multi-genre papers where they do, again, research on a topic and they kind of regurgitate it, that's not the right word, in the form of, it could be a menu, it could be an obituary, it could be a poem, it could be any kind of text that brings out some of the research that they've learned in a repurposing way. Guiding questions for repurposing: is the repurposing compatible with the original text being repurposed? Is the repurposing original? Is it adding to the conversation? I think this is the thing that we really, tried hard to do at Glenville, not just, if you look at that second bullet point, is the repurposing original, not just fill in a 5-paragraph essay template that the teacher had given out, but repurpose in an original way, in a way that is the student's own way. Is it adding to the conversation? And has the student made connections between the text and personal lived experiences? And finally, the last step of this curation model is reflecting. And this can be done, through quick writes, learning logs, reflective letters, and obviously, the affordances that we have in any LMS these days of kids being able to design and put together their own digital portfolios. It's amazing, and there's really no end to the way that they can, again, collect, organize, repurpose. And what's great about this is follow from year to year their progress, their own progress. Guiding questions for the reflection stage: how have you grown during the past few weeks? What do you need to work on? One that we talk a little bit in the book: did you experience being in a flow state? If so, when? Many of you are probably familiar with Csikszentmihalyi's flow concept, and we have found that kids that are really getting into this do achieve that kind of flow state where they'll say, I worked on this multimodal memoir for like 4 hours at home. And here's some assessment questions that there, you might be wondering, how can you assess this? How can you slap a grade on this? I think it's possible, and we have demonstrated that, and we have some suggestions in the book. Before I turn it over to Dr. Jenkins, I just want to say that Shannon and Ga-Vita and I will be at NCTE out in Anaheim on November 18th. We're speaking Friday, November 18th at 9:45. So if you're going to be at NCTE, please join us. And then I'll be at the Literacy Research Association in Phoenix, December 2nd at 1:45. So I'm now going to stop sharing and turn it over to the esteemed Dr. Jenkins.
Well, thank you very much. And I am so honored to be asked to participate in this session with the two of you. This is a remarkable book and a remarkable set of activities that you have identified and offered to us. And there's so many levels I'm excited about it. One being just this recognition that curating is a kind of core literacy skill for the 21st century, one that needs to be actively encouraged, one that spills over into a range of everyday life activities, and one that fosters not only interpretive and critical literacies around traditional reading, but also creative literacies, the ability to express yourself, to find your own voice as a young person. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of phases of my own research that I think connect with some of the themes that you've shared with us today. And I'm going to really do that in 3 phases. One is talking a little bit about fan cultures and the work that I did quite early in my career and continue to do around fan communities. Second is the work we've done around new media literacies for the MacArthur Foundation, and another teacher's college book that I helped contribute to and shape, Reading in a Participatory Culture, which is about how to remix Moby Dick for the English language or literature classroom. And finally, I'll say a word or two about the work we're doing now on civic participation and young people, and the kinds of what we call the civic imagination, which is also something that I think represents a bridge between the literature classroom and the social science classroom, much as the way that you were talking about The Hate You Give bridges between the discussions of social justice that might be in a social science classroom and the literary analysis of a novel. So at the beginning of my career, close to 30 years ago, I wrote this book, Textual Poachers, Television Fans and Participatory Culture. And at the time, it was very traditional to think of fans as passive consumers of media text, largely uncritical, slavishly invested, overinvested, some might say, in existing stories. And I wanted to turn that on its head and say, wait a minute, the fans I know are taking stories they consume and actively rewriting, remaking them, repurposing them in your term. And they do it by fan fiction writing, which was still a largely underground practice at this point. But today we would see more and more young people involved in fan fiction writing at a place like Archive of Our Own, which to me, alongside Wikipedia, is one of the great landmarks achieved by participatory culture practices. But they were reading closely, engaged in intense discussions and debates about the stories that mattered to them, rewriting them, often with a focus on characters, but in mobilizing evidence from the text to support their interpretation. And much fan fiction rehearses. How do you think, where do your ideas come from in the text? Today, we might well point to memes, or we might point to cosplay, or music videos, and bidding practices, many other forms of creative expression that fans are involved with. And one of the questions the work on fandom taught us was to think about appropriation in a somewhat different way than it's being talked about today, right? We're hearing a lot of critiques of cultural appropriation. The issues there are really important. But our research was showing that all literary texts start with acts of appropriation. Bakhtin, the literary theorist, tells us we don't take our words from the dictionary, we take them from other people's mouths. And they come dripping with the taste of where they have been before. And so understanding that leads to thinking about critical literacy in a somewhat different way. Now, that doesn't make the problem of cultural appropriation disappear. It sharpens our understanding of it, because cultural appropriation raises ethical questions about who can take what stories for what purposes. What do we owe to the original sources of those stories? How does power come into play when dominant groups take the stories of marginalized groups and use them as their own property and profit from them? But that's different from saying all appropriation is bad. To me, allusion, a term we use in literary analysis, relies on appropriation and repurposing of other text, and it is an important principle of literary analysis. So, jump forward in time about 15 years. I'm asked, based on that book, to help head up an effort the MacArthur Foundation launched to look at new media literacies. And I headed a team that wrote a white paper identifying some core skills of what constitutes literacy for the 21st century. And what we were seeing was a growing percentage of young people were creating media and sharing media they created with others on the web, in classrooms or not, in formal learning spaces. And so we looked back on this idea of participatory culture as a site of informal learning. That fandom, the gaming communities, that now we point to blogs and podcasting and a variety of other communities are sites where young people are learning from each other and teaching what they're learning about how to express themselves in this digital environment. And so we did this white paper for MacArthur, confronting the challenge of participatory culture. And then we did this literacy project this book is based on, which was about how to read in a participatory culture. And so some of the things we did there we were having the focus on Melville because we saw Melville as someone who mashed up much of the literary genres of the 19th century, right? Want to think about multi-genre Moby Dick. What makes it difficult is it's a multi-genre work, right? It's remixes everything from encyclopedia entries to discussions of artistic reputations of whales and whaling to biblical stories to the scripts of plays. And as Ricardo Pizzwale, the African-American playwright, theater director from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, that we were working with, put it, this matters because everyone was on that boat. People from all different ethnicities and races were on the Pequod. And people ever since have been trying to reinterpret and really understand what Melville is about. And we felt the best way to understand it was to think of Melville as a fan of whaling, to think of remix as something that was running through hip hop culture and techno culture at the time. And that we can go, by going back and forth between those things, we would understand what Melville was doing better. We also had students learn to use Wikipedia and participate, change the Melville entry, change the Moby Dick entry for good based on their research, and then debate and stand up for the validity of some of the claims that they made. In the process, learning how collective intelligence operates. We had them print out pages from the book and annotate them and illuminate them. That is, put information around the edges that shaped the way they read those texts in different ways. And we had them map their own reading practices, not unlike your portraits and silhouettes. We had them say, identify things you read, because many of them had been told that they didn't read, or told themselves they didn't read. And once we open it up to include comic books and magazine stories and billboards and breakfast cereal boxes, turns out they read all the time. And that was really illuminating for them. It wasn't literacy they lacked. It was that they had a different idea about cultural hierarchies than the adults in their lives. And they were being taught to devalue their own skills, competencies, and their voice. And that, I think, was part of what we were trying to do to bring that in. All right, again, let's jump forward another decade. What are we looking at now? The generation we were looking at then, who were playing around with video games and fan fiction, are now the young activists in the streets for Black Lives Matter and March for Our Lives and any number of other political movements, environmental justice movements, for example. And what we're seeing worldwide is that young people are fighting for social justice using a vernacular from popular culture. That is, they are fan activists. They're taking stories and dressing up like handmaids to stand in front of state capitals to protest for reproductive rights, or using the three-finger salute from Hunger Games as a symbol of wealth inequality. The Hong Kong students are singing songs from Les Mis, specifically Can You Hear the People Singing, as they march by the millions through the streets of their city fighting for democracy. In the Middle East, in Brazil and India, people are dressing up like the Na'vi from James Cameron's Avatar to protest against the exploitation of indigenous people. And Harry Potter became a central rallying point for struggles over, for example, fair trade chocolate, which they were able to take on Warner's and force the studio to change its policies regarding chocolate to guarantee that it is not being created using exploitative child labor. So this is what we call the civic imagination. It's what I'm working on now. And by civic imagination, we mean that we are inspired by stories. We use stories to tell political truths. So I like to point to the statue of George Washington in the Smithsonian Institute, where Washington is wearing a toga and sitting on Apollo's throne. And that's because a core literacy of the founding fathers came out of studying classical Greek and Roman texts. Similarly, we could look at Dr. King's work and see the book of Exodus, which would have been shared by Black church leaders as a central kind of text that was quoted and retold over and over again. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not be able to cross the River Jordan with you. I may not make it to the promised land. Those metaphors run through the text of the founding civil rights leaders, including Dr. King. And that is a kind of use of stories or borrowed stories for the purpose of telling different truths. So for us, the basic model is that we use our imagination to think about social change. Before we can build a better world, we have to imagine what a better world looks like. We have to imagine ourselves as a civic agent capable of making change. We have to imagine ourselves as part of a larger community of shared interest. We have to imagine a process of change which might yield results. We need to feel empathy and solidarity for peoples whose experiences are different from our own. And from the writing about Black radical imagination, we take the idea that you have to imagine freedom, democracy, dignity before you've directly experienced it. That's the imagination of Selma, right? Where John Lewis and others are registering Black people to vote at a point where nothing in their prior experience suggested there was any positive gain, and there was only risk in doing so. Yet they dared to imagine a world where Black people would be in government, would have power, would be part, might even be president. And that registering the vote was the first step forward toward achieving that fantasy, that dream. And so that's what we mean by civic imagination. And it rests on the kinds of critical literacies that you're describing in your work, including the ability to tap existing stories, to bring stories that are meaningful to you together in some curatorial way, to make sense of the world around you. And that's why I think the work that you are both doing are so important for the future of learning in America, for the future of social justice in America. And I'm really inspired by everything you're describing here.
Wow, great. Right back at you, sir.
Thank you.
Well, now I think, Emily, we're going to take some questions, I believe, right?
Sure. Yeah. So what a wonderful conversation so far. Thank you all. I want to encourage our audience to put their questions in the chat. We've got a few minutes here, and we'd love to hear from you. To kick things off, we have a question from Troy. He says, as a university-based teacher educator who has many times tried to establish sustained professional learning partnerships with K-12 colleagues, what advice would Dr. Kist and Ms. Davis recommend for developing such partnerships, especially in the pandemic era with the challenges of COVID-19 still present in so many schools and communities?
Well, I think that's one of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Troy Hicks, who's asking that question. And he, I think, has done a lot of great work with establishing partnerships. I was fortunate enough to get identified by a company called the Institute for Student Achievement, which is out of New York City. And they wanted some coaching done in the Cleveland schools. And I was fortunate enough to work for them because their whole premise, they are aligned with Teachers College, Columbia, is inquiry learning and building capacity for inquiry teaching. And so I had the good fortune, Troy, of working for a company that, you know, was not asking me to go in and make sure that the daily objective was written on the whiteboard, and, you know, that there was some kind of, you know, rote kind of lesson planning going on. So that was right off the bat. And I don't believe in that type of coaching anyway. I mean, I think, to answer your question, I think the way to establish partnerships is to listen. I mean, the coach has to listen. And I was really pleased to work with Shannon and Ga-Vita and Shanita and so many other teachers there that were willing to talk very openly and honestly about their work. And I was just there to kind of capture it. So I think it was kind of an ideal world. I do still work for that company, and I do work in various schools, and it just seemed like there was just kind of a spark here with Shannon and Ga-Vita, Shanita, and myself, that was just kind of one of those things that doesn't always happen all the time. But I don't know if I answered your question, but I know probably everybody on this call believes in that. I mean, you don't want to go in as a coach or an administrator with some kind of top-down type approach to fixing things. I just stepped back and watched what they were doing, and it was completely, perfect for their community. And I just started writing about it. So. Do you have anything to say, Ms. Davis?
Yes, just to piggyback on what you said, the way that we were able to come together was, it was just fate. But in other situations, I know I'm in a ton of teacher groups online, on Facebook, and I see a lot of collaboration starting there, where K through 12 teachers will see a need. And then sometimes the collegiate, colleague can maybe just offer some support, and it goes from there. Like Dr. Kist said, just with some listening, just some open dialogue, and see where we can meet in the middle. And you can hopefully, I want more people to experience what we experience working with Dr. Kist. It's really, really been phenomenal. Like he said, we've been a benefit to him, and he's been a blessing to us.
Wonderful, wonderful. We have a question for Dr. Jenkins. This is from Dimitri. I really appreciate your mentioning fandom. I wanted to know your thoughts on fans of video games holding companies accountable for improper representation, especially of SWANA, since this goes beyond a national level, but an international level of fighting for social justice.
Well, I think it's been a very important space. Gamers holding game designers accountable, pop fans of K-pop holding K-pop artists accountable for their appropriation of Blackness, Black hairstyle, Black speech, Black dress, has paved the way for collaborations across national borders, as you're suggesting, and getting young people exercising their voices, often independent of schools, on issues that really are significant to them. And as they find their voice, they're developing tactics that allow them to have some initial successes. So I've looked less lately at the video game space, but I allude to the K-pop thing because that was Black women bloggers and podcasters calling out K-pop artists that help to educate K-pop fans worldwide about issues of racial representation in the United States. And once we got to 2020 with Black Lives Matter, K-pop fans played crucial roles in support of Black Lives Matter, in part because they had a shared social infrastructure, they were connected to each other, in part because they had technical expertise. They were good at manipulating algorithmic registration systems as part of being fans. And they were able to come together quickly and do some things that helped in tangible ways Black Lives Matter activists during that crucial time period. So I think it is both important on its own terms, and it's important as a stepping stone toward greater participation in the political process. And we've seen in the last couple of elections more young people voting, say, than ever before in American history. And we're hoping that will continue to be the case in the midterms when they come up next week.
Wonderful. We have a question from Chase. This is for Ms. Davis, but Chase says they would be interested to hear from any of the panelists on this question. Do you ever have students that are either resistant or apprehensive to interacting with the social justice aspect of the curriculum, either because they feel it isn't related to them or just because of the defeatist mentalities passed on to them by adults in their lives outside of school? How do you help these students understand the power that their voice has?
Fortunately, so far it's gone well. We started the unit pre-pandemic, and I was concerned about the same thing. I just had a group of students that were at that point very engaged. And if I can connect it to a current event, something going on currently maybe in Cleveland, or even a larger scale issue, I would usually get the buy-in that was needed. And with the population at our school currently, majority African-American students and a smaller population of Hispanic students, it's an instant connection because it connects to their communities and what we've been through. So I was able to get it initially. The challenge was when we were learning virtually. I think all teachers I've met have just had challenges virtually with the buy-in of the students because of, various reasons. So all I could do at that point was just try to connect it historically, or using something current with when Black Lives Matter took off heavier in the 2020. In 2020, when we were out of school, I was able to connect it, and the kids connected that were logging on consistently. The ones who weren't, I can't say I made the connection, but it was seeing certain images, whether it was George Floyd or just different cases. Even though it was sad and the pandemic was already presenting challenges where I know students were depressed, they were just engaged because I think they could see themselves or see their fathers, uncles, or brothers. And there was just an automatic connection. And I think it did help for my students who were engaged as we were going through the pandemic. They, like I said, I think basically because they could see themselves and they could relate.
Wonderful. Dr. Kist, Dr. Jenkins, do you have any thoughts on this question that you'd like to share?
Well, I think I have not encountered any resistance to it either, although if we follow the news, we certainly see the attacks on critical race studies as a backlash against the ways that social justice is effectively being integrated into the classroom. But to me, the secret of all of this is starting where your students are, and figuring out how far they want to go down a particular path. It means taking seriously their existing literacy, the texts they're invested in, the issues that matter to them, and helping them find their voice. And it may be in some schools, so-called social justice issues aren't the right set to help students make that venture. But I think taking students seriously where they live and what they care and valuing what they care about. Because so often teachers are saying to students, oh, what you're interested in doesn't belong in my classroom. And unfortunately, that communicates the opposite, that what's in your classroom doesn't belong in the rest of their lives. And so the more we erect those walls, the less able we are to leave a lasting imprint as educators on the ways they see themselves in the world.
I would just jump in quickly and say, I think one of the issues early on, Ms. Davis, wasn't there some discussion about school lunches at Glenville?
Yes.
I think that was something that they got involved with. So I echo what Dr. Jenkins is saying. And I also want to echo what he said. I remember one time I was in a different school and a couple kids started riffing on an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. And they went into such detail about the different characters in a SpongeBob episode, and the teacher just shut it down. Totally shut it down and wanted to get back to whatever worksheet, was being done. And I think that teacher missed an opportunity.
Interesting. We have another question from Karis. I think this is for anyone on the panel to respond to. Were youth interested in critiquing social media bubbles or talking about algorithmic justice? If so, how did you address this and advocate for change?
I haven't had that experience yet, so I'm sorry I won't be able to really give any good feedback.
I think when I was in the classrooms at Glenville, I think the teachers were careful about, making sure that students were considering sources and making sure that that kids weren't, in those kinds of bubbles that we all sometimes find ourselves in. I found that there was definitely that critical piece was there. It wasn't just, take whatever is the first source you find on your phone. It was, how do you use your phone intelligently? So I think I felt that there was definitely attention paid to those type of algorithms.
Well, this is algorithmic stuff is not my strong suit, but the Journal of Media Literacy just released a special issue on algorithms as a kind of critical literacy for the 21st century. And it's maybe the first time I've seen them invite math teachers to become part of the media literacy movement, because they're the ones who really can take us into the algorithmic aspects, and it can turn on an interest in math for people who might otherwise have zoned out. So check that out. It's online, the Journal of Media Literacy, and I think you'll find a lot of good materials from educators for educators there.
Wonderful, wonderful. We have a question from Abby. How have you all handled multimodality for grading and assessment? What do you look for when assessing the assignment? Can you elaborate a bit on that, Bill and Shannon?
Well, again, I felt that Shannon and Ga-Vita were expert at designing rubrics, but very simple rubrics. Sometimes the rubrics that I see for these types of multi-genre projects just become so complicated and almost dictatorial, that I think that one thing I liked, and we do have some examples in the book, that they're not overly complicated. They're targeted. But I think, you can design a rubric to assess anything. And, that we are very careful to put some standards in our PowerPoint, to show that, Shannon wasn't just flying blind. I mean, she was using Ohio standards, which are, tied into the Common Core. Short answer is, just design your rubric carefully and co-construct the rubric with the students.
That's a good idea. And we definitely, our approach was to be multimodal, because at Glenville, we have 80-minute blocks, which to me is just a bit long for our age group of students. And we really wanted to be as engaging as possible, especially during the time where we were learning virtually. So we definitely try to incorporate it. As Dr. Kist said, we definitely would create rubrics. But one of the good things about Ga-Vita and I, she was the special ed teacher. So we would do some of the same activities, but she could adjust her scale and her rubric a little bit different for her students.
Interesting. Well, I think we have time for one more question. I noticed a lot of the educators who signed up for this event were submitting questions at the point of registration, and kind of related to this question of assessment, there were several questions along the lines of, what do you do if you have a school or a district that is resistant to, approaches outside of the canon? In the words of one of the registrants, how do you tell colleagues to get with the times, so to speak? So what would be your advice to teachers who might find themselves having resistance to these sorts of approaches?
We only encountered one administrator, probably towards the beginning of our time with Dr. Kist, who was resistant. And I felt that we kind of had to sell him on what we were doing, to let him know it was going to be a blend of a book like The Hate U Give with Cleveland Public School District's main source of curriculum, which is Springboard, with additional text. One text I was using, I'm sorry, I cannot think of her last name, The New Jim Crow. Her name is Michelle, and I can't think of her last name. In addition to current events, in addition to a book, a story such as The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. We had to sell him that it wouldn't just be limited to one thing. We would incorporate various things within the text set that would still have the rigor that he was expecting, and that we knew our students needed. So I felt that when he saw things in action, I think we were able to get his approval. But like I said, it was really only one. Thank you, Michelle Alexander. Thank you.
I would just say very quickly, you know, the key is text sets, showing administrators that, you know, you have a wide range of texts, including the canonicals. I'd also point to what Dr. Jenkins said during his section about Moby Dick being, you know, multi-genre and having so many elements that actually do relate to today's pop culture.
Wonderful.
Shakespeare is a no-brainer in that regard too.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's about all the time we have. So I want to thank all of our panelists for their time being here this afternoon. I want to thank the audience for joining us. And everyone, please look out for that email in a few days with the link to the recording of this event. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.